blow out the moon and turn the moon into blood. Come back, angel, and bolt the door. Well, the time has been, it won't be no more. You got to hurry.
Some of the most exciting stories of history are the actions of people against oppression. John Brown fought to end slavery and gain the rights of citizenship for all black people through the creation of a black nation in North America. His armed attack on Harper's Ferry in 1859 is one of the turning points in our nation's history. This event inspires art and poetry, story, and song, wherever deliberate courage is admired. Playwright Lorraine Hansberry described Brown as a white man who dismissed all qualifying considerations and answered the slavery of black men with the consecration of rifles.
You got to hurry, 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 keep in touch with the Son of God. You got to hurry, 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 the time is drawing near.
It was a criminal offense to escape slavery or assist fugitive slaves, even in the free northern states after 1850. The Underground Railroad, a mass movement of black and white resistors, formed a conduit through which flowed many to freedom. The roots began in the South with assistance from other slaves. Many who escaped came back as conductors to lead others out. In addition, secret militant defense groups developed among escaped slaves and free blacks in the North. A few whites, such as John Brown in Springfield, Massachusetts, in 1851, joined their forces.
We whose names are hereunto affixed agree to constitute ourselves a branch of the United States League of Gileadites. We agree that we will provide ourselves at once with suitable implements and will aid those who do not possess the means, if any are disposed to join us. We invite every colored person whose heart is engaged for the performance of our business, whether male or female, old or young. The duty of the aged, infirm, and young members of the League shall be to give instant notice to all members in case of attack upon any of our people.
John Brown, grandson of a veteran of the American Revolution, Yankee farmer, sheep raiser, once owned a leather tanning business in Webster, Pennsylvania. Like his father, Owen Brown, he was in radical tradition. The elder Brown moved to the western frontier of Ohio in 1805 when his son John was 5 years old. In youth and in his own home, theirs was always a station on the Underground Railroad. The country's most eloquent fugitive slave, Frederick Douglass, first met John Brown in 1847. Douglass wrote of that meeting.
About the time I began my enterprise in Rochester, I chanced to spend a day and a night under the roof of a man whose character and conversation and whose objects and aims in life made me by several prominent colored men, among whom were the Reverend Henry Highland Garnett and J.W. Logan. In speaking of him, their voices would drop to a whisper, and what they said of him made me very eager to see and know him. Fortunately, I was invited to see him in his own house. It is said that a house in some measure reflects the character of its occupants. This one certainly did. In it, there were no illusions, no make-believes. Everything implied stern truth, solid purpose, and rigid economy. Whenever he spoke, his words commanded earnest attention. Certainly, I never felt myself in the presence of a stronger religious influence than while in this man's house. When on the street, he moved with a long, springing, racehorse step, absorbed in his own reflections, neither seeking nor shunning observation. Such was the man whose name I had heard in whispers. Such was the spirit of his house and family. Such was the house in which he lived, and such was Captain John Brown, whose name has now passed into history as that of one of the most marked characters and greatest heroes of American fame.
The two became fast friends, never passing through each other's town without stopping. Their paths separated for a time, however, when the western territories of the United States became the battleground between slave and free labor. There, the settlers were to choose between entering the Union as a slave or free state, an issue which had more to do with control of the federal government than the condition of workers. Among the free state immigrants who came to Kansas in 1855 were John Brown's sons and their families. They braved the howling winds and snows of that first winter with little food, built sod houses on the prairie, and planted seeds and grapevines. But when John Brown wrote to ask what he could send them, his sons replied, "Guns." Abolitionists in northern states sent weapons to the Kansas Free State settlers for defense against harassment and even ambush murder by pro-slavery ruffians. John Brown brought the guns himself to the little community near the town of Osawatomie. In 1856, he and other Free State activists met to plan stronger communal defense in response to the burning of Lawrence by the ruffians. As smoke still rose from the ashes of the Free State town, news came of the beating of Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner on the floor of Congress by a Southern representative who was offended by Sumner's passionate speeches against slavery. Brown's rifle group decided to enact a direct retaliation. They pulled 5 pro-slavery settlers who made threats upon Free State families from their beds, brought them to the Pottawatomie Creek, and slashed them to pieces with broadswords in the style of Nat Turner. The territory was now bloody Kansas.
We, citizens of the United States, and the oppressed people who by a recent decision of the Supreme Court are declared to have no rights which the white man is bound to respect, together with all other people degraded by the laws thereof, do for the time being ordain and establish for ourselves the following provisional constitution and ordinances, the better to protect our persons and property, lives and liberties, and to govern our actions.
Well, we need more power, power, Lord. I didn't need more power, power, Lord. I need
In 1857, Dred Scott, by decision of the Supreme Court, was denied all rights of citizenship because of his race. The critical issue was more than slavery versus freedom. It was racism and constitutional rights. For 30 years, Black Americans had petitioned the government for redress of their grievances using the convention movement. They had as little success as the colonists who used the same technique with King George 80 years earlier. John Brown saw this national racism present in the Western Territories when white men who fought to make Kansas a non-slave state then denied access to Black Americans who wished to immigrate. He saw white immigrants flood the plains beyond Kansas and envisioned an independent state or nation for Americans denied citizenship, especially 4 million slaves whose emancipation now in 1858 John Brown intended to personally guarantee. His proposals had the immediate precedence of the Mormon Nation established in Utah and the resettlement of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. Using abolitionist donations to Kansas, John Brown traveled the country by horse and rail to find the national black leadership identified through the convention movement. He found strongest support among Westerners, delegates to state conventions held in Chicago, Detroit, and Ohio. The recently organized black immigration movement had met in Cleveland. These leaders formed the nucleus of an enthusiastic response. His old friend Frederick Douglass was less interested in a separate nation or mass immigration. But Douglass had put his mind to the abolition of slavery, which was precisely the plan of John Brown.
From the night spent with John Brown, while I continued to write and speak against slavery, I became all the same less hopeful of its peaceful abolition. My utterances became more and more tinged by the color of this man's strong impressions. He told me the true object to be sought is first to destroy the money value of slave property, and that can only be done by rendering such property insecure. My plan, he said, is to take at first about 25 picked men and begin on a small scale, supply them with arms and ammunition, and put them in squads of 5s on a line of 25 miles. The most persuasive and judicious of these shall go down to the fields from time to time and induce the slaves to join them, seeking and selecting the most restless and daring to retain in the mountains, and send the weak and timid to the north by the Underground Railroad. When I asked him how he would support these men, he said emphatically that he would subsist them upon the enemy. Slavery was a state of war, and the slave had a right to anything necessary to his freedom.
Burns, falls, rises, stumbles on from darkness into darkness, and the darkness thicketed with shapes of terror,
and the hunters pursuing, and the hounds pursuing,
and the night cold, and the night long, and the river to cross, and the jack-o'-lanterns beckoning, beckoning, and blackness ahead.
And when shall I reach that somewhere morning? And keep on going, and never turn back, and keep on going.
Renegade, renegade, renegade. Many thousands rise and go, many thousands crossing over.
oh mythic north, oh star-shaped yonder Bible city.
Some go weeping, and some rejoicing.
Some in coffins, and some in carriages.
Some in silks, and some in shackles.
Rise and go, or fare you well.
No more auction block for me. No more driver's lash for me. If y'all see my Pompeii, 30 years of age, new breeches, plain stockings, Negro shoes.
If you see my Anna, likely young mulatto, branded a E on the right cheek, R on the left.
Catch them if you can, and notify subscriber. Catch them if you can, but it won't be easy.
They'll dart underground when you try to catch them. Plunge into quicksand, whirlpools, mazes. Turn into scorpions when you try to catch them.
And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. North Star, Bonanza Gold, I'm bound for the freedom, freedom bound. And oh, Susanna, don't you cry for me.
Renegade, renegade. Rises from their anguish and their power.
Harriet Tubman, woman of earth, whip-scarred, a summoning, a shining, mean to be free.
And this was the way of it, brethren, brethren, way we journeyed from camp to camp. Moon so bright, and no place to hide. The cry up and the paddy rollers riding. Hound dogs belling in bladed air. And fear starts a murbling.
Never make it. We'll never make it.
Touch that now?
And she's turned upon us, leveled pistol glinting in the moonlight.
Dead folks can't jaybird talk.
She says.
You keep on going now or die.
She says.
Wanted, Harriet Tubman, alias the General, alias Moses, stealer of slaves.
In league with Garrison, Alcott, Emerson, Garrett, Douglas, Thoreau, John Brown.
Armed and known to be dangerous.
Wanted, reward, dead or alive.
Tell me, Ezekiel, oh, tell me, do you see Mel Jehovah coming to deliver me?
Hoot owl calling in the ghosted air. 5 times calling to the haints in the air. Shadow of a face in the scary leaves. Shadow of a voice in the talking leaves. Come ride my train. Oh, that train. Ghost story train. Through swamp and savannah. Moving.
Moving.
Over trestles of dew.
Moving.
Through
Moving.
caves of the witch.
Moving.
Midnight special on a saber track.
Moving.
Moving. Moving. First out mercy and the last hallelujah.
Dear son John, I am succeeding to all appearances beyond my expectations. Harriet Tubman hooked on his whole team at once. He, Harriet, is the most of a man naturally that I ever met with. There is the most abundant material and of the right quality in this quarter, beyond all doubt.
John Brown came to our town for volunteers to fight in his Army of Freedom under General Tubman. Chatham, Canada West, was a terminus for the Underground Railroad and haven for many of us free persons of color from the United States who wanted the full rights of citizenship. We could no longer vote in our native Pennsylvania, but my father, Mr. Abraham Shadd, was elected to the town council here in Chatham in 1858. My brother Isaac and I published the Provincial Freeman newspaper here, where issues of slavery and self-government were energetically debated. John Brown knew from our record that he would find support for a new black nation at the Freeman, and came directly to our office in April 1858. He was looking especially for a contributing editor, Dr. Martin Delaney, our town's physician. Mrs. Delaney was quite taken aback by this serious man with his long white beard, who called 3 times before finding the doctor. She thought he was one of the prophets in the Bible come to life. "It is men that I want, and not money," Brown told the group of nearly 40 colored men at a secret anti-slavery convention organized by Delaney on May 8th. Money can hide, but men must step forward. Many of these men did step forward, counting on promises of money from white abolitionists in New England to fund them. These Secret Six, as they were called, were men of prominence and national fame for their intellectual leadership. The proposed nation was a kaleidoscope of diverse anti-slavery groups turning in the firm hand of John Brown. He brought his Kansas fighters and also veterans from the popular wars in Europe who had come to America after their revolutions failed in 1848. These strongly anti-slavery men showed us a worldview that included European support. Brown made his military strategy from the successful Haitian slave revolution led by Toussaint Louverture 50 years ago, and the rebellion of Nat Turner and other Virginia slaves in 1831. Something there was about John Brown that made a profound impression upon us immediately. We found him a Puritan of the most exalted type. The provisional constitution which he had written that winter at the home of Fred Douglass was the order of business for the convention. After 2 days of debate, the men unanimously approved it. Isaac Shadd and my husband, Mr. Thomas Carey, were among the delegates. I was pleased to note that it included the right to bear arms for males and females, and suffrage for all the oppressed people of the United States who chose to live under it, not only freed slaves or people of color, and John Brown meant all women. This Constitution was a compact, like that of the Mayflower Pilgrims, for guidance and order in their long journey to settlement. When Brown was in Kansas, he saw many large groups of white immigrants who established similar formal constitutions as they traveled through the territories. They were not protected by laws of states of the Union. He planned a communal organization where all property was held by the nation and work supported and benefited all. Yes, some of us who knew dear old John Brown and were thought sound enough to be entrusted with his plans by him, have the greatest opinion of fighting anti-slavery. Give us plucky abolitionism.
But no sooner had it begun than the coalition unraveled. An Englishman who had fought in Italy was promised $600 to translate a French guerrilla warfare manual for Brown's company. Argument over these funds and strategic leadership arose. Hugh Forbes tried to persuade the Secret Six and some Eastern black abolitionists, including Douglass, to pay him and denounce Brown. The Boston whites panicked. 5 of them, excluding Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was ready for action, told Brown that the revolution would have to wait for the Forbes affair to blow over. Black leaders saw that the lack of resolution among their white supporters would be deadly if it occurred after the planned liberation movement was underway. The postponement produced caution which even the strong-minded and charismatic John Brown was unable to dissuade. But the largest damage can never be told. Brown had tapped the network of secret black associations, often called the Mysteries or Liberty Leagues, who were the conductors of escaping slaves and the protectors for the nation. The door was open for John Brown, who proved himself with the League of Gileadites among black men and women in Massachusetts in 1851. But in 1858, there came with him some whites for whom anti-slavery action was the hot trend of the moment. The Black Convention had trusted them, and some behaved with racist ridicule. The door to the mysteries closed shut, and the revolution went backwards. But not for John Brown. He went back into Kansas and lived among Free State vigilantes who became known as Jayhawkers. He grew bitter and estranged from the white Eastern abolitionists and brooded continuously over his plans. In the dead of December 1858, a Missouri slave found John Brown and asked him for help in escaping to Canada with his family. Brown organized a few of his companions into two parties who crossed the Missouri border and liberated 11 slaves from several farms. One slaveholder was killed in the raid when he apparently moved for his gun. But the group traveled openly, unharmed and unarrested, through town after town in America's heartland. There was public Thanksgiving in Iowa, one led by J.B. Grinnell. The response of Midwesterners to the fugitives and himself convinced Brown that the time was right to declare war on slavery in the South. He wrote his own story of the Missouri Rescue and sent it to the New York Tribune. Brown began welding his revolution back together. This time, it had a different shape. He decided there must be a dramatic first strike which demanded unequivocal support from white abolitionists to succeed. Army moved into Mrs. Ritten's boarding house in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania in the spring of 1859. Situated just north of the Mason-Dixon line, which separated slave and free states, Chambersburg was Brown's ordnance station to receive weapons which had been hidden in friendly, often Quaker homes in Iowa and Ohio. 200 Sharps rifles arrived at the depot. There were also iron blades, 9.5 inches long, attached to 6-foot wooden handles. John Brown's pikes, designed for the self-liberation of slaves without guns, and especially for self-defense by women and children on plantations not yet secure. Black members of the Army boarded at the home of Eliza and Henry Watson as they arrived, the Chambersburg station on the route of the Underground Railroad. 21 young men answered Brown's call. Most were stronger on action than words. Several whites had been in Kansas with Brown. Some were sent by Lewis Hayden, Brown's Boston agent, who worked in the office of the governor of Massachusetts. White or black, only American-born men were in the company who declared war on slavery with John Brown. It was an army of relatives. 3 were Brown's sons, and 2 were neighbor brothers who had married or were engaged to his daughters. 2 more brothers were a bit wild in their Iowa Quaker community. Brown found an uncle and nephew, John Copeland and Louis Leary, in a Cleveland jail where Oberlin students were held for helping a man escape from bondage. Isaac Smith and Sons, registered at the Washington Hotel in Hagerstown, Maryland on June 30th, 1859. Yankee farmers, they said, tired of cold winters. Maybe they would prospect for minerals in the hills of the Blue Ridge. They rented a farmhouse in a mountain community called Samples Manor. carefully. Maryland was a slave state. Weapons were transferred by wagon from warehouses in Chambersburg. The young army surreptitiously moved in with them. To avoid suspicion among neighbors, Brown sent for his 16-year-old daughter Annie and Martha, the 17-year-old wife of his son Oliver, from his New York farmhouse. Brown and his family fit very well in this mostly white farming settlement, which included many Dunkers, a pacifist and anti-slavery group descended from German immigrants. They were plain, hard-working people with whom the Browns had much in common. The family attended church regularly. As the number of Brown's army increased in the farmhouse, the necessity of hiding them created tensions. Who wore all those shirts hanging on the line? Annie Brown, in later years, wrote of life at Kennedy Farm headquarters.
Our nearest neighbors were a family who had rented the garden that was just behind our house, so they had a good excuse for coming at all times to look at the garden and at us. Little Mother Huffmaster and her brood of 3 little girls, the oldest 7 years old, and a big boy baby, all barefooted, Little Mother and all, had a troublesome way of calling on us at all hours of the day. Sometimes she would appear when the men, invisibles I called them, were downstairs at their meals. I would tell them, shut the door, and stand on the porch to keep her out as long as I could, finding some excuse, while Martha would put things out of sight in the kitchen, and the men would all go upstairs again, taking the victuals, dishes, tablecloth, and all with them. This would all be done without so much noise as the rattling of a spoon. It happened quite frequently, but we did not dare to offend her, however troublesome, for fear she would tell what she saw, so I would give her things to keep her friendly.
There also lived in the neighborhood a former slave, Dangerfield Newby, who had been freed by his owner, who was his father. By Virginia law, a manumitted slave could not remain in the state. Dangerfield Newby moved to Ohio to raise money to buy his own wife and one of his 6 children from slavery to another owner. 5 of his children were too profitable to sell, and when Newby arrived with $1,000 for his wife and baby, their sale was refused to him also. Dangerfield Newby found work across the Potomac River in Maryland and plotted to free his family. That summer, John Brown moved to a nearby farmhouse with his Liberation Army. Newby joined the company. By September, most of the recruits who would finally participate had arrived. Only one came from the Chatham group of black men who had signed the Provisional Constitution 18 months earlier. He was Osborne Anderson, a printer for the Provincial Freeman newspaper. Anderson was a freeborn Pennsylvanian who had moved to Canada to live with more rights. He hurried to Brown's headquarters and learned their target was Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It was the site of a federal arsenal and gun manufacturing operation. It was civilian run, a pork barrel of the first families of slave-holding Virginia. Brown now wrote to Frederick Douglass and asked him to meet him in Chambersburg. The war was now on. Douglass came, traveling with a fugitive from South Carolina who had fought in organized slave resistance. Joseph Winter, a local gunsmith and pioneer resident of Chambersburg, owned property next to a stone quarry. He arranged a secret location for Douglass and Brown.
We, Mr. Caggie, Captain Brown, Shields Green, and myself sat down among the rocks and talked over the enterprise which was about to be undertaken. The taking of Harper's Ferry, of which Captain Brown had merely hinted before, was now declared as a settled purpose, and he wanted to know what I thought of it. I at once opposed the measure with all the arguments at my command. To me, such a measure would be fatal to running off slaves, as was the original plan, and fatal to all engaged in doing so. It would be an attack upon the federal government and would array the whole country against us. Of course, I was no match for him in such matters. But I told him, and these were my words, that all his arguments and all his descriptions of the place convinced me that he was going into a perfect steel trap, and that once in, he would never get out alive, that he would be surrounded at once and escape would be impossible. He was not to be shaken by anything I could say, but treated my views respectfully, replying that even if surrounded, he would find means for cutting his way out. But that would not be forced upon him. He should, at the start, have a number of the best citizens of the neighborhoods as his prisoners, and that holding them as hostages, he should be able, if worse came to worse, to dictate terms of egress from the town. I looked at him with some astonishment that he could rest upon a reed so weak and broken, and told him that Virginia would blow him and his hostages sky high. Rather than that, he should hold Harper's Ferry an hour. Our talk was long and earnest. We spent the most of Saturday and a part of Sunday in this debate. Brown for Harper's Ferry, and I against it. He for striking a blow which should instantly rouse the country, and I for the policy of gradually and unaccountably drawing off the slaves to the mountains, as at first suggested and proposed by him. When I found that he had fully made up his mind and could not be dissuaded, I turned to Shields Green and told him he heard what Captain Brown had said. His old plan was changed, and that I should return home. And if he wished to go with me, he could do so. Captain Brown urged us both to go with him, but I could not do so, and could but feel that he was about to rivet the fetters more firmly than ever on the limbs of the enslaved. In parting, he put his arms around me in a manner more than friendly, and said, "Come with me, Douglas. I will defend you with my life. I want you for a special purpose. When I strike, the bees will begin to swarm, and I shall want you to help hide them. But my discretion, or my cowardice, made me proof against the dear old man's eloquence. Perhaps it was something of both which determined my course." When about to leave, I asked Green what he had decided to do, and was surprised by his coolly saying in his broken way, "I believe I'll go with the old man."
I dreamed I was in a wilderness sort of place, all full of rocks and bushes, when I saw a serpent raise its head among the rocks. Then it became the head of an old man with a long white beard, gazing at me, wishful-like, just as if he were going to speak to me. And then two other heads rose up beside him, younger than him. And while I wondered what they wanted, a great crowd of men came rushing in and struck down the younger heads. And then the head of the old man, still looking at me so wishful. When I met John Brown, I knew this was the old man I had seen in my dream. I could not make out what the dream meant until the news came from Harper's Ferry. And then I knew the other two heads were his sons, dead.
Brown tried to get word to General Tubman that the attack must be moved ahead. The farmhouse was under suspicion as an Underground Railroad station. The girls were sent home to New York, but Tubman and other fighters from Canada and Kansas could not arrive in time. The Harper's Ferry arsenal and town were taken by Brown and 17 men in the midnight hours of October 16, 1859. A small company then moved into the countryside to take hostages among slaveholders previously selected by Brown. First chosen was Lewis Washington, great-grandnephew of President George Washington. The symbolism Brown wanted was underscored with the demand of a formal surrender of a famous sword which had belonged to President Washington to a black man representing the new nation, the printer Osborne Anderson. Slaves at the farms of the kidnapped slaveholders returned to Harper's Ferry with Brown's men. This was not the agricultural South of large plantations with hundreds of workers producing rice, cotton, and tobacco. Most slaves worked on small farms with only one or two others. Even the largest slaveholders near Harper's Ferry held only about a dozen people of profitable age. But the word did spread among the sparse local slave population, and throughout the night, an estimated 50 men and women, including 11 moving in with Brown's army and their hostage owners, joined the liberating forces. A number tore up railroad tracks and removed telegraph wires in the vicinity, while others were armed and patrolled with Brown's men. Events turned wrong almost as soon as they began. Brown ordered his men not to fire unless attacked, but his jumpy son Oliver fired twice at persons running away from him. The second incident killed a railroad watchman, a free black man who was leading an armed party out to investigate the disturbance. The shooting of Haywood Shepherd confused the small local black population. It set the stage for Brown's indecision, for if he had acted promptly, he might have left with all the weapons at the arsenal. Grimly he fought on, losing his men singly or in small groups, out of communication and without alternative plan. As local whites came into town in larger and larger numbers to combat the insurrection, they were able to dislodge the outer guards. Dangerfield Newby and 2 local slaves were among the first to die on Brown's side, but not before Newby killed 2 men with his Sharps rifle. One of them, a despised slaveholder who was probably pursuing his own bondsman. 10 of Brown's men and at least 3 slaves died in the Battle of Harper's Ferry. Their forces killed 5, including the mayor of the town. The steel trap predicted by Douglas enclosed the abolitionist army early in the afternoon. Its speed was assisted by Brown, who stopped a passenger train, then let it continue. When President Buchanan learned of the attack on the federal arsenal, he sent 90 Marines, led by Army Colonel Robert E. Lee, the same man who would command the Confederate forces against the United States in the Civil War. It took them 12 hours to travel the 60 miles between Washington, D.C. and Harper's Ferry. They found Brown surrounded in a fire engine house, still holding the hostages with such regard for their safety that they all testified in his behalf at their treatment. Two of his men slipped through the dragnet on that rainy Monday afternoon, Osborne Anderson and Albert Hazlitt. Thinking Brown captured when they saw the engine house surrounded and a white flag extended by their captain, the 2 made their way through town, hiding in basements until dusk, then crossing above the rocks behind town. They followed the railroad along the Potomac until they came to a sawmill and found a rowboat at the same point the Virginia militia had used in the middle of the day to cross the river and encircle Brown. The bridges were all guarded, so Anderson and Hazlitt moved west along the towpath of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal for 5 miles until they could pass under an arch which lets a Maryland creek into the river. The 2 hurried back to the farmhouse headquarters, looking for 5 of their original 21 who had spent the entire day on the Maryland side loading weapons while the battle raged in Harper's Ferry. All had vanished when they arrived, soaked and exhausted at midnight. Gone also were all weapons, provisions, everything but a box of matches. With these, the 2 were able to survive roasting dry corn left after harvest on the mountains as they made their way towards Pennsylvania, the native home of both men. Outside Chambersburg, Anderson and Hazlitt decided it was too dangerous for a black and white man to move together. Albert Hazlitt was caught and arrested and sent to prison with John Brown and 4 surviving Army members in Virginia. Osborne Anderson made his way north with the help of the Underground Railroad, just as if he had been a fugitive slave. At Henry Watson's in Chambersburg, he received food and hurried advice to go to the home of William Goodrich, a wealthy black merchant in York, Pennsylvania. Goodrich owned the tallest building in York of its day. He hid Anderson in a stairway closet there for 3 weeks while the trail cooled. From there, he went through Philadelphia, the Underground Railroad station of William Steele, and then through Cleveland to Canada. From Safe Haven, he wrote an account of the fighting at Harper's Ferry. His book, A Voice from Harper's Ferry, was edited for publication by Mary Ann Shadd, for whom Anderson worked as a printer. Although literate by 19th century standards, Anderson needed the experience of his editor to make a usable record of the only battle participant of Brown's army who survived and was not hanged. When Osborne Anderson looked back at Virginia, he roared with outrage from the meeting halls of northern black churches at what he saw, a cover-up of the participation of 50 local slaves who fought on Brown's side with him at Harper's Ferry. Our slaves are happy, and we take care of them. They did not join Brown's army, but were kidnapped prisoners along with us, said the local slaveholders. Their early relief at not being killed soon changed to characterizations of cowardice. That message quickly and effectively reached the country because the artist for Harper's Weekly, a national magazine, was a local slaveholder named David Strother. As cousin of the prosecuting attorney for Virginia, Strother had unlimited access denied other journalists, some of whom were told to leave the state if their dispatches were too sympathetic to Brown or to the anti-slavery cause. The slaves all ran to us for protection, said the Virginia authorities, meanwhile declaring martial law and bringing thousands of militia into the area, ostensibly to guard John Brown and 5 men in prison, actually to control further insurrection. With all the precautions, the barns of the jurors in Brown's trial were burned by the local slaves. The slaves did not rise to aid Brown when he was surrounded, said the northern abolitionists and historians, ignoring the ratio of 9 whites to 1 black in the vicinity and the absence of directions from Brown's men. We did not want to join the abolitionists, said the slaves whose owners were taken hostage by Brown's men. If they had not, death by reprisal would be as swift and extensive as that following Nat Turner's failure in Virginia 28 years before. Mutilation of the bodies of identified black men who died in Harper's Ferry made the issue abundantly clear. Not all were able to save themselves in the aftermath. Ben, arrested and jailed in Charlestown with Brown, was not tried, but died in jail within the week. The official cause said fright. Within 3 weeks, his mother, Arlie, was reported dead by the owner from pneumonia brought on by exposure. I never did intend to make insurrection, said John Brown, for it was mass emancipation, not massacre, which he began. Brown was tried for murder, for conspiring with slaves to commit insurrection, and for treason to the state of Virginia, not the federal government. He was sentenced to hang on December 2nd, 1859. From the time of his capture until his execution, John Brown turned around his military failure. The nation, indeed the world, was aroused by his willingness to die to end slavery and the personal bravery of all his tiny army. By their action, the world stopped for a moment to consider the immorality of slavery. And when the moment passed, the world was a different place because of it. The eulogies were also immortal. Most famous was his song, John Brown's Body, which Julia Ward Howe, wife of one of the Secret Six, made into the battle hymn of the Republic. And the poets, Whittier, Whitman, Melville, Sandburg, Binet, and especially the voice of Langston Hughes, whose grandmother was the young widow of Louis Leary, killed at Harper's Ferry. Her second marriage was to Charles Langston of Ohio, who was part of the 1858 Black Nation movement. Perhaps you will remember John Brown wrote their grandson, who died for your sake. Frederick Douglass went to England, where he would have been extradited and hanged for complicity had he stayed. He pondered the course of what he called the nation within a nation and returned to mobilize it for the Union cause in the Civil War, which began a little more than a year after Brown's execution. Douglass persuaded President Abraham Lincoln that black soldiers must liberate slaves in the Confederacy and prove the merit of Brown's original plan. As they probed deeper into the southern states, the black soldiers could finally bring lonely freedom to Harriet Newby, the widow of Dangerfield. She was sold south after her husband died in the Battle of Harper's Ferry. Harriet Tubman continued to Harper's Ferry as she had promised and guided 7 slaves who had aided Brown to freedom in Canada. She returned a soldier in the Union Army and liberated 700 slaves in a single day along the rice plantations of the Low Country near Charleston, South Carolina. The survivor, Osborne Anderson, served with the United States colored troops. Many Canadian immigrants returned to fight to end slavery with the Northern armies. Martin R. Delaney was commissioned the first black American field officer. Mary Ann Shadd was commissioned by the state of Indiana to enlist refugee-freed slaves into the black regiments. The clear message of John Brown's goal of self-determination for oppressed people resounded worldwide. He was awarded a gold medal of honor from the nation of France, presented to his widow, Mary Brown. You can find a statue of him in Paris, as well as in Osawatomie, Kansas. In Haiti, Avenue John Brown is a major road linking Port-au-Prince and Pétionville. His vision continues as an inspiration among freedom fighters in the Pan-African movement of today as well as yesterday. The architect of that movement, W.E.B. Du Bois, wrote a biography of John Brown in 1909 which defined the international meaning of John Brown's sacrifice. The price of repression is greater than the cost of liberty.
In the first place, I deny everything but a design on my part to free slaves. Had I interfered in the matter in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, it would have been all right. I see a book kissed which I suppose to be the Bible. It teaches me to remember them that are in bonds as bound with them. I am yet too young to understand that God is in a respecter of persons. I believe that to interfere as I have done, as I've always freely admitted that I have done, in behalf of his despised poor, I have done no wrong but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in the slave country, whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say, let it be done.
Power, Lord. power, power, Lord. Yes, I'm talking about the power, power, Lord. We're about the everlasting power, power, Lord. We're about the everlasting power, power, Lord. We don't need that power, power, Lord. We don't need that power, power, Lord. I've been brother had the power, power, Lord. My brother had the power, power, Lord. If he wiggle in the power, power, Lord. If he talker in the power, power, Lord. If he sing with the power, power, Lord. And I'm talking about the power, power, Lord. Well, everybody need power, power, Lord. Everybody need power, power, Lord. It ain't the true born power, power, Lord. It ain't the true born power, power, Lord. Well, the captain got the power, power, Lord. The captain got the power, power, Lord. He got the everlasting power, power, Lord. He got the everlasting power, power, Lord. He got the power that'll save you, power, Lord. Well, the power that'll save you, power, Lord. Yes, I'm talking about power, power, Lord. Yes, I'm talking about the power, power, Lord. I'm gonna moan with the power, power, Lord. We're gonna moan with the power, power, Lord. We're with the true born power, power, Lord. Well, the true born power, power, Lord. Ain't no Honda have power, power, Lord. Ain't no Honda have power, power, Lord. See that Ella got the power, power, Lord. Well, the Ella got the power, power, Lord. Well, he preacher in the power, power, Lord. Is he preacher in the power, power, Lord. Save a soul in the power, power, Lord. Save a soul in the power, power, Lord. When I'm talking about power, power, Lord. Yes, I'm talking about power, power, Lord. About the everlasting power, power, Lord. Well, the everlasting power, power, Lord. With his true born power, power, Lord. With his true born power, power, Lord. Well, I'm trained about power, power, Lord. We're gonna pray with the power, power, Lord. With the everlasting power, power, Lord. Yes, I'm talking about power, power, Lord.